Hello and welcome to my latest video. So in this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint the head of the bone dragon, which is from the Tomb King's army from the OldWorld game. So the bone dragon is very much a centerpiece model, but at the same time I'm going to be painting this as something for an army. So I have bought a whole army for the Tomb Kings. I'm very keen on playing basically old Warhammer. Something that I used to play a lot when I was a kid, and then I kind of got out of the habit, and then it was discontinued. So they've re-released, well, kind of like they've sort of updated it a bit, but it's still kind of, you know, old Warhammer. And the Bone Dragon is a brand new model, one of the very few new models for the Tomb King's army. So to start with, I'm using a mix of Mournfang Brown and XV88. It's around about 50-50. The exact mix doesn't matter too much. Basically, I want the Mournfang Brown colour, sort of that reddy brown, but it's a little bit too dark on its own. So just adding a bit of the XV88 makes it a bit lighter. The nice thing is that the XV88 is a base colour as well, so it's got a little bit higher opacity. And also there's a sort of a yellowy element to the XV88 as well, so it doesn't make it too cool or too pinky by adding the extra paint in. And I'm using an Artist Opus small dry brush as well to apply this first layer. So if you look at how I'm applying it, it's like a very obvious sort of stippling method. It's not dry brushing, and it's important. There's, you know, an obvious distinction between the two. The obvious thing is that it's a wet brush, because you can see the wet paint as I'm applying it all over. That's really important, because if you just dry brush this on, you're going to get sort of like a dusty kind of look to it, which kind of, you know, sounds like it should be accurate for a Tomb King's army. But for this case, in terms of the paint build-up, if you're using dry paint when you are applying sort of like a dry brushing method, it's going to build up very, very quickly with all the layers I'm going to be applying. So the first thing that you do is you damp the brush, put it in like a water pot or whatever, and rub it on some kitchen roll so it's damp but not wet. You don't want the paint running off the brush. Then you just sort of like stipple it all over. It will take like 2 or 3 layers, but it's a very quick process. What you'll find as well is when you apply it, so you can see it leaves all these little tiny dots all over, and they look very strong when the paint's wet, but because the paint is also thinned down, so we're not using this straight from the pot, it's around about 2 parts water to 1 part paint. So, and when you apply it, so that you get these little dots over. So at the moment I'm using Morghast bone now, so we're already up to the second stage highlight. On the first stage, when you were just using the 50-50 mix of XV88 and Mournfang Brown, you just sort of slam that all over the model. You don't have to be careful at all about where it's placed. You know, just make sure you get a good coverage, and you want it to be quite opaque when you finish. So it's, you know, there's a colour all over it. If you don't get enough down and you leave it very translucent, so you can see the black primer still showing through, when you get to the Morghast bone here, it's going to look a lot colder. The XV88 and the Mournfang Brown, that adds a lot of the warmth that will show through as we add these extra layers, because these layers are very, very translucent. That's why I say so. The paint is thinned down when we're applying it. What you do is you take the brush, you dip it into whichever colour you're using. So obviously we started with the mix, and now we're up to the Morghast bone. But you get quite a bit on the brush, and then you have some kitchen roll, so you can see I'm resting my hand there on it at the moment, and you sort of like dab off the excess so that you don't get like flood the model when you start applying it. I mentioned, so you cover the whole area of the bone quite significantly when you're using the XV88 and the Mournfang Brown, but now that we've got to the Morghast bone, we become a little bit more picky with where we place the brush. So you can see the marks I make are a bit more delicate, and we're looking for sort of a kind of a transition, so going from darker to lighter. One little mistake that it's not really a mistake, but I kind of missed a bit. If you see on the kind of the flared out bits, you know, where it's got the metal crest and it comes down to these sort of teethy bits that stick out at the sides, either side of the head, the join part of those, they need to be highlighted up, because later on I'm going to be glazing those areas down and putting some definition in them. So if you don't go lighter to start with, they're already too dark, and you know adding extra dark on top, it doesn't make a massive difference to it, and it just looks a bit dull all over. But you need to highlight them. So what you'll see is later on in the video, I do go back with these colours because there's left on the wet palette. So it is handy to have a wet palette for this kind of thing, because you always have the colours there if you want to just add a little bit of colour here or there, or you've missed a few things, and you don't have to mix all the paint again. But apart from that, and now I'm up to Screaming Skull. So this is the highest highlight that I go to for this stippling method. Now that I'm on to Screaming Skull, you have to be even more careful than you were before. So you can see I'm much more delicate now about where I'm placing the marks. Very light with how I apply the brush as well. Just with and it has to be a very straight on mark when you do it. Remember, it's not dry brushing. You don't want side to side movements. You want to just dab the brush straight onto the model and get that sort of texture mark. So it looks very heavily textured at this point. I think that actually looks quite cool. And you can kind of, if you just want like a very quick process for painting the models in your Tomb King's army, I think that would work all right as a tabletop standard, just for getting all the bone done, because it looks very old, very weathered. It's maybe a little bit too high contrast, and from the processes on from here, I will be basically softening down a lot of these texture marks. But what you'll find is if you just don't do anything to the bone from this stage, and you just sort of painting the trim, maybe if you just want to use some metallic paint or whatever in a wash, that will just neaten it all up. So just painting the teeth, paint the trim, and you're good to go. Basically, it'll look good on the tabletop. It's just from now on, I'm just going to be adding extra details, and there will be another stage later on where I add even more, because again, it is a centerpiece model, and it'll be up to you if you want to use these sort of extra techniques or not. The teeth, I think, are worth picking out, or at least separating from the main body of the skull. So I'm painting the teeth to be a little bit lighter, using the same colours still, but what you'll find is by applying them with like a normal brush rather than a dry brush, the movements that you make, and because they cover a whole, in one stroke you cover like a much larger area, and it's not stippling, like the surface texture looks different, it looks smoother and it looks cleaner, and it will just look lighter as well. And for the top teeth, what you do is you start at the bottom of the tooth and then paint upwards. So what will end up happening eventually when I've added the second highlight is that the brightest part of the tooth will be at the top, where you remove the paintbrush from the model, and it'll look shiny. So you don't have to make the teeth look perfect. Remember, it's a very old, battered looking skull, but it is worth just being a little bit neat if you can be. So now I'm up to Screaming Skull, and I'm just focusing more on the very top section of the teeth, again to go for that shiny look. I will be putting a white dot on the teeth, so the teeth will end up looking lighter than the bone, and already because of the smoother brush marks I'm applying to it, the teeth look very distinctly different as a surface material compared to the bone itself. I think it's quite nice to have it like that. It's not a lot harder to do. The only thing is that there's quite a few teeth, and if you've stuck the jaw and everything together like I have, the teeth on the lower jaw are a little bit more tricky to paint. But if you wanted, you could only paint the outside of the teeth and not worry about the inside. I do end up painting the inside as well. It didn't take that long, but it is a little bit just tricky really, because you have to get your brush in there, and I'm not sure how big an impact it actually has, and you can just assume that they're in shadow or whatever, because the angle that you'll see the dragon head from, it's you very much looking top down anyway, so a lot of the stuff on the inside of the mouth isn't going to be very visible. You can see there as well. So I just did the final highlight on the teeth, from what I'm showing on the video anyway. From the right hand side, you can just see like a little white dot on the shiny part of each tooth. A bit later on, you'll see suddenly all the other teeth are painted, but you've seen the basic process anyway. So now I'm going to be kind of softening a lot of the texture that's on the skull, and for that I'm using Skavenblight Dinge. Now Skavenblight Dinge is it's a layer paint, so layer paints tend to be more translucent. I'm not sure if Games Workshop intended it to be like that, or just the way that certain paints are more translucent than others, and judging by how well they cover, they either go into base or layer paints. But basically what it means is that Skavenblight Dinge has pretty poor coverage, but it's really nice for glazing. So you take some from the pot, water it down around about 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and use a reasonably large brush for this. So I'm using an old Artisopa size 2 brush. The size doesn't matter too much as long as it's a pretty large brush, and the only reason I say it needs to be a large brush is just so that you can cover the area a bit quicker. You can use a small brush if you want, it's just how much time do you want to spend glazing these things on. And the nice thing about Skavenblight Dinge as well is that it's not a very dark grey. It's quite neutral. It's got a little bit of warmth to it as well, which just sort of helps with the texture. If you go for like cooler grey colours, you're going to end up with basically cool looking bone. I don't mean cool because it looks good, I mean cool because it just looks like a bit sort of empty, lacking life, and just a little bit less interesting. Whereas having a little bit of that sort of warm colour in there, especially because as a Tomb Kings thing you want to maybe emphasise a little bit more on the desert dwelling aspect of all the models for the army. Having a bit of sort of warmth in there does help. So now I've gone back to the mix, the XV88 and the Mournfang Brown, and that's very watered down now, so it's around about 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and I'm using this around the teeth. Ideally, when you do this, you will do it with all the teeth painted, so you can do it all at once. The top row teeth, they're a little bit more tricky, so you can see there I actually put a little bit too much of the the colour down. It made it quite obvious. It just looked a bit too much, even though it was still watered down. So I went back with the XV88, not the XV88, sorry, with the Skavenblight Dinge, and then just sort of painted over the top of it, so it knocked back that very sort of browny colour, but it's still there. It still gives a hint of it, and it gives sort of colour to the jaw area as well, and separates the teeth out and makes the teeth look even shinier in comparison to the rest of the model. But using that base colour still, the XV88 and the Mournfang Brown, for the bottom row of teeth, you'll see this in the photo at the end. If you glaze from about halfway down the tooth to where the tooth connects to the jaw, it'll make the teeth look a little bit sort of like there's plaque build up or something on them. Makes them look very grubby anyway, and it just makes it look really nice, again separating the teeth out from the colours of the actual skull. So here, this is kind of like an optional bit of detail to add. Again, just sticking with the colours that I used on, for the stippling process. So it's Morghast Bone and Screaming Skull. I'm just picking out a few details here and there because remember, I've already gone with the Skavenblight Dinge and glazed a lot of the model. By the way, when you're doing the glazing for the Skavenblight Dinge, you're looking to push the sort of 3D element to it. Now obviously it's a 3D sculpt, but to create depth is probably a better way of saying it. So you want the highlight areas to be brighter than the darker areas, and by glazing in from like the mid-tones to the shadows, it's basically making the lighter areas brighter. But one area that would benefit quite a bit from just a little bit of extra highlighting is the eye sockets and the brow, just so that you get a bit of focus around there. So the lower edge on the eye socket, that's particularly important to pick out. You can see that I went up to Screaming Skull on that. Don't go too crazy with the Screaming Skull picking out details. I know it was used in the stippling process, but that's, apart from the shine on the teeth, is pretty much the lightest part on the on the skull. So if you use too much of it, it's very stark when you do that. You want to probably stick more to the Morghast Bone for picking out sort of like random details. If you wanted to spend a lot of time on this model, you could even pick out all the sort of cracking type plates, or the cracking effect coming on the head plate anyway, and picking out all the edge details, all that kind of thing. I really wasn't that bothered about picking out details that precisely. But again, depending on how much time you want to spend on the model, how much detail and things. So if you remember earlier on, I was talking about these bone spikes coming off the plate on the head. I said I was going to glaze on them. You can see I started glazing here, and this is with Rhinox hide, but because I didn't get enough of the stippling bone effect up on at the connecting point on both sides of the bone spears, the glazing didn't do anything. It just made it sort of more browny. So you will see in a moment suddenly that I've gone back in with the Morghast bone and the Screaming Skull and just sort of stippled all over it with the stippling brush, or the dry brush rather, again, just to fill in that area, give it a base to work on, so that when I glaze over it, there you can see. So I've gone over it quite clearly. I think I actually also went over with the XV88 and the Morghast bone mix, so you can see actually in a few places on the model where it's suddenly got a little bit browner. There was a bit of excess left on the brush. I just did a tiny bit of stippling here and there, just to add a bit of colour, in various places. It's up to you if you want to do that or not, but I think it just helped retain a little bit more of the warmth, because the more that you go through with the brighter highlight colours and the Skavenblight Dinge glazing, the more you take away from those warm colours. So now that I've actually gone back and added these extra stippling areas at the edges of the plate where these bone spikes come out, I can then go back again with the Rhinox hide. Now the Rhinox hide is quite watered down. It's around about 2 parts water to 1 part paint, maybe a little bit more. But the main thing is you want a reasonably large brush, so size 1 or size 2, something like that, from about 2/3 of the way up, then drag strokes down towards the tip of the brush. I'm actually already at this stage up to black, so you can use, I'm using Vallejo model color black, but you can use like any black you want really. Like Abaddon black is fine to use, but for the black you're around about halfway down the bone spike, going down to the tip, and if you just leave it to dry and you do 3 or 4 coats of it, you get a really nice transition going through like the brown texture near where it connects, and then it gets darker and darker going through the Rhinox hide to like a perfectly black tip on it. Then also, or while you were using the Rhinox hide, but you can also use the black as well if you want, just do a little bit in the connecting point between the spike and the crest, because that will just push the definition, and because you should hopefully now have some highlights either side, so on the spike and on the plate, it will just push the contrast between the two and separate them out. So now very quickly we're on to the metal part. This is like kind of it's very messy and it's kind of fun to do. I am using a Kimera colour for this, and so it's called Fallen Grass, and it's like a custom colour from them as well. Not custom for me, but it's like they've got the artist. It's a Michael Pazarski colour, so I'm not sure how easily it is to find this. The reason I'm using it though is because it gives a very nice matte finish. However, if you wanted a similar Games Workshop colour, I would suggest going for something like Sybarite green. It's very, very close to this. It's not quite as matte though, but you could put matte varnish over the top and get the same kind of effect. But in terms of colours, the Sybarite green would be fine. I watered this down very, very heavily. I probably could have not watered it down quite as much, but all I wanted to do was just get the sort of green colour into all the recesses and just knock back the Mournfang brown. So just in case I haven't mentioned, the metal is all covered as a base with Mournfang brown, and then I've given it this wash of the Fallen Grass colour. It's around about 5 parts water to 1 part paint. So very heavily watered down, but you just cover all the recesses, and then you leave that to dry. Now that will take a while to actually dry, so while that was happening, I've gone in with the black again and I've watered this down, and now I'm just basically blacklining all of these recesses with these sort of cracking effects on. Don't go too crazy with this. You don't have to be super accurate because it's so heavily watered down. The capillary action will pull the paint in there. You could use like a contrast or wash paint, and those will sort of technically they'll work a bit better because the medium on that does pull more into the recesses anyway, whereas I'm just using watered down paint. But because it's watered down, it dries a little bit softer, and you'll get like a more matte finish as well. It doesn't matter whichever route you choose to go, but I was just being lazy and I had some black paint, so just fill in those areas, and it just makes them look a bit more defined anyway. You want the paint quite heavily thinned, and it will just create a bit more contrast and a bit more detail. What I did now, so this is, I don't want to say it's a mistake, but it was a poor choice. So I'm using my size 00 brush, and I started doing like a stipply, scratchy kind of effect to get all the, a nice sort of textured effect for the weathering for the Verdigris. So I'm still using just the fallen grass paint, but it's a bit thicker, so it's about 50-50 water to paint. Anyone that tried using the Kimera colours will discover that they're very thick paints straight from the pot. You always have to water them down. It might even be that I've added a bit more water because the mixtures tend to be a little bit different to Games Workshop ones, which I usually get away with around about 50-50. Some a bit more water, some a bit less, but that kind of sort of ratio. But for the Kimera ones, it's probably a little bit more water because they are very, very thick when they come out of the little pot. But anyway, the mistake that I've made is using the small brush at this stage, because I'm going to be working on this a lot more, and it's a very large area, so it's just taking a long time to do it. What I actually end up doing is going in with the old size 2 brush that's very worn down, so it doesn't have a sharp tip on it, and just using the same paint. So it's quite thick paint still, so you get the more opaque marks, and I just sort of scrub it, jab it, kind of stippling, but you don't really want the dot effect. So when we did the bone, you could very clearly see all the little dots here and there. Of course, all the glazing has softened them down, but you still get that really nice texture effect sort of showing through in a kind of subtle way. Whereas for this, I don't want so much of a dot effect. So using like basically not a dry brush, but like a normal brush, and this is why I say use an old one, because you don't want to be wrecking your brushes, expensive brushes, using painting techniques. But that sort of brush will give like a different look, a different mark to it. I will show you in a moment, it comes up on the video hopefully, that I use a larger brush to finish the rest off. But I do go back with the original mix that I had. So this is, remember, the very watered down one, and I added some white to this. So there's like 2 stages of highlight. It's not really highlight; it's reverse highlighting, because the Verdigris really wants to be lighter in the recesses, and the reason for that is because the Verdigris, as the metal oxidizes, it'll be in the recesses where it gets knocked off the least, whereas if it's like a very prominent area, and you're going to be seeing when I actually paint some non-metallic metal highlights on the metal, those areas will not have oxidization on, because the assumption is that the oxidization will have been knocked off or rubbed off in some way on the model in universe. So it's always important to differentiate between the in-universe when I'm talking about it and the actual model, because obviously you don't want to be rubbing paint off the model when you're using it. So here you can see where and just to quickly show you, so I'm using my old size 2 brush, and you can see very clearly, very quickly, that it makes larger marks much more quickly. You just cover the area, it's less fine detail, so, and you don't really need all that sort of stippling with the tiny brush. And I would strongly suggest you do this. Don't even bother with the first stage where I did it with using the size 00 brush, because it just takes too much time. But after you've then done that with the the size 2, go back in again with the 00 with the highlight color. So this is again around about 50-50 white to fallen grass, and then just and again, it has to be the watered down, because you're just letting the paint sort of flow into the recesses. So you can see like around the central section where it's like in the recesses where it's all lighter and that kind of thing. There's no great sort of detail involved. It's not that hard work or anything, but you just want to kind of like make it look messy, but a little bit controlled about where it is. But now, so this stage, I think, is purely optional. If you just wanted a nice sort of verdigris effect, just using the greens over a base colour of Mournfang brown, it looks like old verdigris. I mean, if you look at a reference for verdigris, that's kind of like what it looks like. You don't really get much in the way of metallic showing through. So this is just kind of adding above and beyond what you need to just to make it look interesting. For these, I've actually gone for a too thin coats paint as one of them. Now, so it's a dark sun yellow. So just to go through the colours actually. So I've got Mournfang brown. It's the 6 paints on the right hand side. Obviously not the greens that we've been using. So it's Mournfang brown in the middle. Then above that it's Mournfang brown 50-50 with dark sun yellow. Above that is dark sun yellow. Bottom right, dark sun yellow with white. Above that is just white. So I mixed the order up a little bit before I placed it on the wet palette. But then above that, it's dark sun yellow, but just, you know, with more white than the bottom right colour. So it's pretty straightforward for the mixes. You don't need too much really of the Mournfang brown. I've got it there as like just in case I need a few transitions here and there, but most of the quick work is done with the Mournfang brown mixed with the dark sun around about 50-50, and you just sort of block in where you want it to be. And the important thing is with this is, again, you can see I'm using an old worn out brush. You don't need to be neat when you're doing this. In fact, if you're too neat, it looks worse with the base layer. You want it to look kind of like scratched metal. The idea being that the metal has been, like the verdigris, has been rubbed off in these places, and it wouldn't be rubbed off neatly. So even if you are trying to be neat, or like you just have a habit of painting neatly, try and make these sort of random little scuff marks on there. The base work, that's where you get all the sort of the randomness down. Then you can be a little bit neater when we come to the highlights, and you'll see those in a moment as well. So I'm at the first stage highlight now, still using like a large-ish brush. So these brushes still aren't available at the moment. We're still working on that, but like if you use a size 1 brush or something like that, you'll get a very similar kind of point on it. And this one's had a lot of wear now, so it doesn't have to be a new brush still. But you're just looking for areas on the verdigris where you want to push the highlights. Not all the highlights, or not all of the sort of areas where the verdigris will have rubbed off. They don't all need to be highlighted. You can, if you see, I just keep doing little dots here and there, little marks, just to pick up. It's mainly the edges of things. That's where the main highlights are going to be going. So don't worry too much about flat area surfaces. In fact, the flat areas kind of look better if you leave them with the verdigris on, because it becomes more obvious. And it just kind of makes sense, when you're picking out the edges of things. You do want a little bit of surface area, because otherwise you're just left with things where it's just edge highlighted all over, and it doesn't make as much sense visually when you look at it. But the nice thing about this is as well, so it has these little triangles all over. And I saw the box art, and I've seen other people paint this model, and they they paint all these triangles with like bright colours like red and blue, and I'm like, that looks like a lot of work to do all that. So I'll skip that process, and I'm just going to cover them in verdigris, and then have them all be basically like sort of bronze. And this makes the process way quicker. You don't have to be neat with a lot of the things. You can see I really enjoy doing this kind of painting, because it's very rough, very sketchy, but it looks effective, and it covers the area quickly as well. If you look, the marks that I'm making now, which is using the dark sun on its own, not only am I picking out the highlights, but I'm also adding scratches to it, and I'm just adding little random dots and scratches all over in various parts of the model. The reason that I went for the dark sun yellow over Balor brown, now you can use Balor brown as well, and you get a very, very similar result, but the dark sun yellow is a little bit more yellow, and I think, I'm not entirely sure, I'll have to double check this, but I think the opacity is a tiny bit better. So it just means that I have to do fewer layers, and I can be a bit quicker when I apply it. But if you don't have dark sun yellow, then stick with the Balor brown. You'll get a very, very similar result, and it's still a pretty good opaque color anyway. It just I happen to have the the two thin coats paint, and I just wanted to try it out a bit more. But it does give, like a slightly more yellow finish to it, so it's quite nice to work with. Now we're on to the next stage highlight. So this is, remember, dark sun yellow with a small amount of white added to it. You're basically just doing the same thing over and over again with these highlights, just getting smaller each time, still keeping that sort of scratchy, rough mark making that you're using, just using the tip of the brush. That it's important that you pay attention to that when you're making these marks. It has to be the tip of the brush when you're doing the scratchy marks. If you push too hard, or you use an angle for like the side of the brush to do it, it's not going to make a scratch, it's going to make a smear. I don't mean that in like a negative effect, a negative way in terms of the mark you make. Like sometimes you want marks like that, but to get the harder looking mark, you really need to use the tip of the brush. I do at this stage every now and then add other little dots and scratches on areas that I haven't gone over yet, but that will be the last time that I will do that, because this is the last highlight color that has a significant amount of yellow in it. Now clearly the next stage highlight, where it's mostly white with a small amount of darks and yellow, does have some yellow in it. The problem is, if you put that highlight color on an area that hasn't been previously highlighted, it looks very cold, because it doesn't have a strong amount of yellow in it. It looks very different to the other scratches on the model, because ideally when you're putting the scratches on and it has another layer beneath it that already has yellows there, but also just because the amount of yellow in those colours in general, it creates a very different look to it, and you get that nice sort of bronzy non-metallic highlight effect. If you start going in with basically what is ice yellow, so if you don't want to mix your colours, you can basically just use ice yellow. It looks almost identical to this, but if you just go in with like this ice yellow type colour and you start picking out large highlights on areas that are purely Mournfang brown, it almost starts to look like you're painting white on it. And because it doesn't have any of the yellow on, it doesn't match with the other, the metallic look, and it looks very, very wrong. I know this because I tried it. One of the triangles, I accidentally painted an edge highlight on one of them that hadn't been previously highlighted with the other colours. It looked awful. It stood out way too much and just looked like the wrong colour. It didn't look like a non-metallic metal highlight. So just be a little bit careful with the highlight placement on those when you get through. If you want, you can go in with a final. So you didn't see me use any white there. You can use some white on the model if you want on those, the very brightest highlight parts. Just be a little bit careful, because the more white that you use, the less shiny they'll be, because you actually make if you have a dark area and you put a small amount of white on, the white stands out a lot. If you have a dark area and then you cover most of it in white, the white it's obviously very visible, but you've actually reduced the amount of contrast, and the white is less eye-catching in that scenario. But so we've got to this stage now. It's pretty much done. Everything else is just sort of like tidying up. So I just went back again with the Skavenblight Dinge. Just picked out a few more areas, darkened down a little bit, looked for areas that I think were maybe a little bit messy. So if you glaze over them when they are, when you can see the texture too obviously, it softens that down because you're reducing the contrast between the highs and the lows. You're bringing everything closer together, so it just makes everything look more soft and subtle. Also, anywhere where the metal touches the skull, if you glaze into that with the Skavenblight Dinge, it creates a bit of a nicer, higher contrast, so the metal looks very obviously separate, and it just makes it look smoother and cleaner as well around those areas. And if you want at this stage, and if you haven't got enough warmth into the bone colour, just go back again with that 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and XV88, water it down to a glaze consistency, so around about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint, and you can just, so you can see glaze in at the base of the teeth, maybe a little bit in a few areas on the textures on the skull if you want, just to add a touch of warmth here and there. One thing I also found is if you have some Skeleton Horde contrast paint, if you're a little bit too unsure about the watering down that base color mix, you can just use some Skeleton Horde and very carefully just glaze a little bit of that onto certain parts of the bone area, and they also add like a touch of warmth to it. But because the contrast paint is very, very translucent, you're much less likely to get that wrong. Whereas using paint, you get a slightly different effect. And if you get that wrong, you can very quickly cover work that you've already done, and it becomes a bit of an issue. Whereas the contrast, you won't have that issue if you've got the mix wrong, because it's already pre-mixed for you. And also it just works differently, so it's naturally a translucent type of paint. And that's pretty much it. So hopefully you've got all the information necessary there to paint the head of the model. I'm going to do another video for how to paint the rest of the Bone Dragon separate from the Horde and Rider, because that's quite a complicated piece. But the majority of the Bone Dragon will be very similar to how I've painted the head. There might be a few little bits here and there where it's slightly different, but if you wanted to go ahead, you can probably get by just using the techniques that you've seen in this video. But anyway, so that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.